An early look at the running back dead zone. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com with me. As always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. Shawn, last week we talked about some early thoughts about Underdog ADP. Towards the end, we were kind of getting into running backs a little. That was a long episode. We got into a lot of stuff. We didn't really have time to get into the running backs too much, but we were kind of thinking through the dead zone a little. And it's a conversation that seemed worth circling back to and having this week. It's an interesting group this year. Certainly, when you look at sites like Underdog, where the receivers are being, some would say pushed up, some would say properly valued. The running backs are falling relative to what we would come to expect. If you look at Underdog ADP right now, there are only 3 running backs in the first round. Just a couple of years ago, that number was more like 8 or 9 or 10, right? I mean, a lot more running backs going early. And even in the years where we've had receivers pushed up, it feels like then the second round might be overloaded with running backs. But this year we only have 4 running backs in the second round. I mean, RB8 isn't coming off the board until the third round. The 25th highest ADP is where Derrick Henry at RB8 is aligned. You get a few in round 3. But as we approach the dead zone, as we've referred to it in the past, this round, middle of round 3, back end of round 3, into round 4 is usually where I say, round 4, you're clearly in the dead zone. Traditionally, you might be 20 running backs deep by that point. But this year, if you look at Underdog ADP right now, Najee Harris is the 36th player at the 3-4 turn. He's RB12. I mean, there's only, a dozen running backs going off in the first 3 rounds. So it changes the way we would think about it probably, because positionally, the running backs that are now falling in the higher area of the dead zone in years past would have been top 3 round picks. So now they're just cheaper values if you think about it a certain way. And then in the back end of the dead zone, the running backs they're not really being pushed up anywhere. So in the back end of the dead zone, guys that would have been dead zone backs maybe in round 6, you can make a case that some of those types of backs are available in round 9, round 10. So now, are they not dead zone backs anymore, or are they dead zone profiles that are being more properly valued, being pushed down? But in that round 9, 10 range, do they have merit? And so there's a lot of really interesting questions as the dynamics have shifted.
So many interesting questions. And I love it. I love it. It just makes 2023 so much fun. Ben, you are frequently credited, I think accurately credited, as coining the dead zone and giving a lot of the early research on that. I know that one of the early things that I ran across in the Roster Construction Explorers from Mike Beers that really blew me away was just how poorly running backs performed in rounds 3 and round 4 when we talk about best ball and we talk about win rates. And you think about that, and as it relates to zero RB, and one of the things that I would always work with subscribers on, or at least discuss and try and explain what my thoughts were on it, was that when you look at the back half, especially of round 1, and you look at the first half of round 2, in the old days, if you select running backs in that range, you're chasing a lot of points, and you're basically building a team that is simply a worse version of the teams that you can get at the top. Now, fortunately for folks, that's been neutralized to an extent in more recent years by especially the 101 at running back has had almost impossible injury results. Now, we know that these guys who go early and have a lot of touches, I mean, those touches come with risk, but still the guy drafted at the very top of drafts, the luck that he has had has been, I mean, you could run this simulation another billion times, and you're going to come up with results like that very, very rarely. Those guys have just got hurt over and over, so that neutralized it. It's made the middle of round 1 very effective for drafters, which is a kind of a double value, because the middle of the round is also the best place from a tactical perspective to be able to enjoy all of the elements that will fall to you throughout drafts and not fall behind runs, all that kind of thing. So the middle of drafts have been very positive for people. But the element of not chasing at running back and going wide receiver to start was always interesting, because then people are like, well, at some point I want to get my running backs beat. You try and get it across to people. You can't get them in rounds 3 and rounds 4 because the results are so terrible. And once you have pushed it, then you get through four rounds, then you're into the 0 RB-ish build, and that's one of the things you'd recommend. You and Jack Miller did a bunch of research looking at how round 5, round 6, a lot of these backs in this entire range, again, they just have performed so poorly. And one of the things about that is that if you are being valued mostly on week 1 volume, it doesn't work. And Ben, you and I have done a ton of shows on why talent matters, why volume projections have a lot of flaws and are going to lead to very bad teams if you draft exclusively on that. It's one of the reasons why you and I like to build through structural drafting and then contingency-based drafting. So we've got a lot of different things that we've done shows on and feel strongly about that intersect here. And the fact that these new ADPs force us to think creatively, I absolutely love it. But the thing that the number one thing before we get into the areas that I think have perhaps more nuance is that with this change that you articulated in ADP, we now have a third round that is just so different than what has been there in the past. And so when I'm looking at the third round, I'm seeing Derrick Henry, Ramondre Stevenson, Josh Jacobs, Breece Hall, and Najee Harris. Those are fantastic profiles. Now, there may be some guys who have injury risk. There may be some players who are getting a little bit older. There may be some players where you question the talent. But in terms of guys who have done it in the past, from a talent perspective, you have Derrick Henry, who repeatedly pulls off these crazy results. People who did it last year, you have Josh Jacobs, someone who has the profile but not the talent, maybe Najee Harris. And then the two guys that I really like, I think that we really like, in Ramondre Stevenson, who is like a little bit better offense away from maybe doing it. And then Breece Hall, it's health. I mean, if Breece Hall is healthy, maybe he's the 101. I mean, you look at the receivers and where they're going this year, even with that, and I think this trend will continue, if Breece Hall is healthy, the thing that you're looking at right now with Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler as the top 2 backs going, those guys are small. With McCaffrey, there could be some offensive element. With Eckler, the offensive coordinator change, maybe you have some things there. If you have peak David Johnson or Le'Veon Bell or Todd Gurley, if you have Christian McCaffrey and he's going to be healthy and is going to be the focal point of the offense, those guys I think would still challenge for the 101. But if we're getting profiles that we think could eventually challenge for the 101 in round 3, that completely changes fantasy football.
Right. Completely. Yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. You mentioned Jack Miller. As I understand it, he's done some great work on this as well. As I understand it, and I talked about this last offseason, and I feel like kind of came to some actually really interesting little nuance about the dead zone just finally last offseason. But Jack's been doing this for several years as well. As I understand it, we had slightly different processes where he was looking at best ball win rates, and I think he found the dead zone to kind of be rounds 3 to 6. And that's been often cited in a lot of places. My original research was not looking at win rates. It was looking at benchmarks that were basically looking at elite running back seasons. It's kind of similar to our buddy Pat Crane has done great work on legendary upside. I was using benchmarks that looked at full season PPR points, partial season where they played at least like half the year but hit a certain number of points per game. So it was like they were showing that type of upside, but maybe they weren't able to finish the year. Still wanted to capture those types of players because we know injuries happen, and that's probably still the type of player that we'd want to target, even if there's an unfortunate injury outcome in week 12 or something. And then I also looked at just a playoff window and wanted to see where some of the late season superstars, that was an even higher points per game benchmark, where some of the late season superstars were coming from. So I was trying to look at these like elite running back seasons or league winning running back seasons was sort of the idea. And I did it over a 10-year span. And what I found was that type of league winning upside for the number of running backs that were drafted over that 10-year span from round 4 to round 9 was my sort of window. The percentage of the running backs drafted in that range that actually showed league winning upside was basically no different than round 10 and beyond. And I think I went to round 16 in my, ADP data, because you can't really go super, super late with ADP data, especially when you're going way back historically. And it was like the same number of rounds, round 4 to 9, and very similar number of running backs drafted between round 4 and 9 over that 10-year span as between, round 10 and 16, and almost the exact same hit rate over a lot of years, over a big sample. And so the argument that I made was we're looking for running back upside. We know there's a lot of pitfalls. And the other thing I would mention, you mentioned the zero RB stuff. I mean, whether I get credited with anything for the running back dead zone, I always say when we talk about this, it all built off the zero RB research, right? And we would talk for a long time, Shawn, about the issue that people would have with zero RB is they would come out of the zero RB build too early. And that was really something that led to me initially writing about the dead zone was people don't like zero RB because they're taking 3 receivers, and then in round 4 and round 5, they start hammering running back, and they're not getting enough depth at receiver. They're calling that a zero RB build. This was more common 5 or 6, 7 years ago. They think that's a zero RB build, and they're seeing poor win rates at zero RB, and it's because they're taking the wrong types of running backs in round 4 and 5. If you're going zero RB, you need to get the firepower and the depth at receiver. You need to get an elite onesie, probably. We've talked about this, and we'll talk about zero RB more. But the point was, we for a long time, Shawn, talked about how even the modified zero RB, anchor RB, whatever. Those drafts where you hit a running back early and then hammer receivers through the dead zone were ideologically a lot similar to a zero RB build than something that didn't take running backs for the first few, but then started hammering running backs by round 4. That's not really a zero RB back. And again, it all comes down to the way you approach that range, rounds 4 and rounds 5 and round 6, which are really traditionally poor ranges to be drafting running backs. And that's the thing that is very well known. But again, getting back to the differences between Jack's research and mine showed that the round 4 to all the way back to round 9 was sort of what I was originally classifying as a dead zone. The difference being Jack's stuff looking at win rates and whatnot did not go as deep as round 7, round 8, round 9. He didn't find that to be as much of a dead zone. It was more this round 3 to 6 range. And I do think there's an element with best ball where that makes sense, where you start to get some cheap prices, even if running backs aren't great. But in 7, 8, or 9, the opportunity cost is lower, and you don't have the waiver wire. You need players, and so that's 7, 8, 9 range is where a guy like Miles Sanders went last year. Was Miles Sanders a dead zone back? And there's people who have said very definitively he wasn't. People have said he was. It doesn't really matter to me. The point is, once he got cheap enough, because Miles Sanders didn't have the type of upside that a Josh Jacobs had. Those two were lumped together a lot, and Jacobs actually hit on a real ceiling. Sanders was about 15 points per game, which traditionally wasn't anywhere close to the benchmarks that I was looking at for the elite ceiling. He was just fine. He was a small win player. The size of that small win or medium win or a large win is really predicated on whether he was drafted in the 5th round, 6th round, or back in the 8th round like he was last year. And the fact that a player like him could be a 15-point per game running back in the 8th round and stay healthy for the most part can be really big in best ball builds. In seasonal and redraft, it's easier to replicate that with waiver wire spot starts. And that's, I've written about that. Frankenstein running back I was writing about last year, and we talked about on the show a lot. Shawn, obviously, the original zero RB research has been discussed on this, but there is a difference to me in the dead zone and how far it stretches and how replaceable these profiles are, especially into that round 7, 8, 9 range in best ball and in managed, because it's a lot more replaceable when you have the waiver wire and you can Frankenstein a running back room, as opposed to in best ball where you don't know which running backs are going to get hurt in the season. You have to build your whole running back crew right now during the draft here. And that element of guaranteed touches that when we talk about the dead zone are kind of a farce, it's a little bit more worth betting into when you get to the round 7, 8, 9 range in best ball specifically, because it does help your build in a way that's everything breaks right. This guy's going to get a lot of touches. And in the atmosphere we're in now, we have guys that profile for guaranteed touches that are cheap enough where the opportunity cost isn't even, you're outside the wide receiver window in some regards. So it changes the whole analysis, especially in best ball for me, when the opportunity cost is no longer, a wide receiver with real ceiling. And we can then make a little bet on, some potential touch value. I mean, I'm taking guys like David Montgomery. If you're talking about him going behind in some cases, any viable receiver or receivers that I would consider super viable, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of okay with him. I don't really like the profile. I'm way more in on Jahmyr Gibbs, but he's going to have a role. He just signed a huge contract for the most part. Like, I can guarantee these touches, and it's actually a situation where I think guaranteed touches are probably valid because the big contract he just signed this offseason. A little later, there are other running backs that I think make more sense in this to this point, but that's a really interesting discussion. That range, whether that's still a dead zone or not, really, to me, comes down to whether you're talking about best ball or managed.
That's an excellent way to put the differences there because, as you mentioned, in redraft, it is so different in terms of how you can replace the value of those running backs. It's interesting because I have a lot of people now who come to me and say that they are completely converted to zero RB in best ball, or maybe still a little bit skeptical in redraft. There are so many ways in which redraft is actually easier, but there are also some ways in which it plays up in best ball. So I love the nuance and the differences between the two games. It's absolutely perfect. We love playing in the FFPC main event. We'll do quite a few of those drafts again this year in all probability. We love playing in best ball. You get to draft all season long. Then as we're looking at this, and as we also think a little bit about the FFPC and how it plays differently with the 2-2-2 format, Colin Kelly and I have just completed a couple of listener league drafts, one in Superflex, one in the regular tournament. They were both fascinating. When you think about running backs and when they would fall, and so we also know that not only is ADP very wide receiver heavy in 2023, but you do get in rooms, and I don't want to say they're necessarily tighter rooms because that's going to depend a little bit on how the season plays out. I just repeatedly mentioned that you can have a season like 2016 again. And if you do, then the people who are going to be right are the people who are playing against this wide receiver avalanche in some way, shape, or form. But both in the drafts that you and I often do, when I'm doing the best ball breakfast with our buddy Pete, when I'm drafting with Column against the OT community, the drafts are even much more wide receiver heavy than what ADP shows us. So you have to adjust again. But when you're trying to adjust, you have to make some interesting decisions. And one of those decisions is whether or not those running backs actually have that crazy upside that you were talking about, that Pat talks about, and that we always look at when we're talking about anchor RB. I'm always fine with people drafting the anchor RB if that guy is actually a superstar. So when we think about Josh Jacobs and we think about FFPC scoring, for example, you're looking at someone who last year led the NFL in rushing and had a fantastic season, and yet his expected points were at 17, right? That's still hugely different than those peak seasons I mentioned from David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell. Very different from a couple seasons we got from Todd Gurley, where Johnson and Bell, they were at 23 in terms of expected points. Now, for the superstars, you tend to outperform them by a couple of points per game as well. But when you're talking about a 5 to 6 point difference, just in terms of what their workloads were worth per game, right? So that's the reason why, in addition to skepticism that he can repeat it, still some minor concerns about talent for Josh Jacobs, and not minor concerns like he's not talented, but minor concerns that he's not a Hall of Famer, right? We know he's talented. And then you had the mild concerns about the Raiders offense. When you put all those things together and you realize that, again, so much of what he did last year was predicated upon the price, which, as you mentioned, it's just so different if you're getting it in the 6th round versus rounds 1 or 2. So when we look at Josh Jacobs in round 3 and we're thinking, well, that seems like this massive no-brainer. It's a huge win. Yeah, I mean, I think if you get Josh Jacobs in round 3, you do have some upside. But is it enough upside to, number one, push us off of guys like Henry, Stevenson, and Hall? And number 2, is it enough upside to push us off of the wide receivers?
Yeah, he's been a really difficult one for me, Josh Jacobs. I've tended to take Stevenson and Hall. I have mixed that up a little bit. I think I mentioned on the show that I've gotten an inordinate amount of 101s and also in the 4 to 6 range. And so I get a decent number of looks at the 2-3 turn, or have been getting a decent number of looks at the 2-3 turn. Particularly in the 3rd, you see Stevenson, Hall fall a little bit, but if Jacobs falls and those guys are gone, I have been willing to consider Jacobs there. I think he's a difficult one. My argument would be that none of those guys are dead zone backs, basically. That the market is buying into what Jacobs did last year enough. And so the other element of the running back dead zone that I've emphasized is that it is an element of wisdom of the crowds, that because I looked at a 10-year sample and the running back trends changed in that 10-year sample. Now, nothing has been as drastic as the running back shift this year, frankly, or in the last couple of years. Things have really shifted in fantasy football in a way that, I mean, even if you go back to 2016, as you referenced, things did shift a lot. And that was the first time we saw a really receiver-heavy room. But that's the kind of year where, even though we didn't see a lot of running backs going, we saw Antonio Brown going 101. We didn't see a lot of running backs going right at the very top. You still saw people then pivoting back to running back in the second and the third round. And that's what I was talking about at the top of the show, where it's crazy that only 3 running backs have gone off in the first round, and then only 4 more go off in the second round. And then, only 5 more in the third and only 2 more in the fourth. And you get into the 5th round, 14 running backs have gone in the first 4 rounds. I haven't looked at 2016 ADP recently. I'd be willing to bet anyone that that's not what happened in 2016. The people were still chasing running backs in the 3rd and the 4th round a little bit, like, okay, it's.
Well, one of the things that happened is you did have the running backs fall into round 3 some. So I think we had a very similar dynamic there. And then those guys hit. One of the things that dictated 2016 was that LaShawn McCoy fell into the 3rd round and then bounced back for a huge season. And so if you put him with a running back start and your first 2 guys stayed healthy and then you had LaShawn McCoy, you were blitzing your opponents. It was almost impossible to keep up with that. So we have a lot of different interesting things going on here. I think that you can make a very easy claim that, there's still a dead zone. It just starts in a different spot. And so as you're kind of hinting, you would probably put it at the end of round 4, maybe even the end of round 5. I like the 2 talents that we get in round 4 are awesome. And that takes us through running back 14, which, as you mentioned, we often get in the first 2 rounds. 14 running backs in the first 2 rounds, that's nothing.
Yeah, I just found one resource for 2016 AP. I don't know if it's valid, but it looks like we had about 14 or 15 through 3 rounds, but then, at least like 4 more in the 4th. It looks like it was a little bit heavier in the, the 3rd, 4th, 5th in 2016. Anyway, the other really interesting thing about those 2 talents you mentioned in the 4th round, ETN and Gibbs, the one thing that we've always talked about with the running back dead zone is when they are young players that have profiles that we don't necessarily know, those are the ones that can hit out of the dead zone. Traditionally, the ones that actually showed elite ceilings, breakout ceilings from the dead zone subset that I have looked at in the past were guys that were first year or oftentimes it was second year players. So Gibbs, to me, is another one where we've talked about that enough, Sean. I think that people are pushing up the young running backs, and I don't know if it's strictly us or what, but people are pushing up the more speculative young running backs, I think, as opposed to some of the veterans. And there is an element here as well where we have some of the veterans are just kind of older and not as appealing. We talked about this last year. The 2nd round at running back was an old group, and it was ready to age out, and a lot of these guys have aged out. So you see like Aaron Jones falling to the 5th. That's just sort of what happens when a guy gets to 28 years old at running back.
And has a backup who's good and a quarterback that people don't trust. But yeah,
right.
Aaron Jones, he hasn't fallen as far as Dalvin Cook and Alvin Kamara.
Yeah, exactly. Some of those guys have fallen even further. But Gibbs, to me, even if he was a dead zone back, he would be the profile you could target in the dead zone, is the point I'm getting at. We've talked about this in the past few years. ETN, maybe not so much, but I don't even know that I would consider him a dead zone back. I say that about ETN because he is going into year 3, although he misses entire rookie year. So we don't have a huge sample. I do think you could still make the case that drafters don't know what he is. When we talk about the wisdom of the crowds element, people maybe don't know what he is yet. We don't have enough of a look at him as a player. I would even potentially make that case for J.K. Dobbins with all the injury issues he's come through the last couple of years. But the point of the dead zone was when we've seen what a guy is, we tend to know what the guy already is, and he's still falling into a range where drafters really aren't buying in. And so actually Najee Harris at RB12 at the 3-4 turn, to me, is a really obvious dead zone guy. That's a guy that we've seen get a ton of work the last couple of years. We know that he's probably not special from an efficiency standpoint. The market is telling us that even though he projects again to be the lead back in his offense and get plenty of work, they don't really want to buy into him. They're not willing to push him up into the Breece Hall, Josh Jacobs range. And I can see Najee Harris falling even further. That to me looks like a guy where that is kind of a dead zone profile. But the larger point I'm trying to make here is it is difficult when you look at the rest of the running backs. Aaron Jones is a good example of it. Joe Mixon goes right around Aaron Jones. He's a tough one as well because it's, I've always looked at the closing ADP, and people have been saying that he should be a third-round pick. I've heard a lot of that, and he might end up in the third round for all I know. He's been rising from like the 8th round, and he's now in the 5th. But then the next round, there's a couple other guys. Dameon Pierce comes up in the 6th. Isaiah Pacheco comes up in the 7th. Those are 2 second-year players where I think you can make the case. We don't really know what they are. Maybe that's why drafters aren't buying into them. I've been mostly shying away from them because that feels like the dead zone. That feels like where drafters are not willing to buy what look like clear roles. Those guys look like the obvious starters in their backfields. That's the type of dead zone back in the past. But being second-year backs, that you could make a caveat for them. Alexander Madison is falling in this range right now. Another one like Mixon that has been rising, and I don't really know where they're going to wind up. So it is like this whole range is a lot more difficult to parse who the clear dead zone backs are. And I think most every other year I've been able to say like, oh, that's the quintessential dead zone back. This is the guy to avoid. Last year I was hammering Zeke. I think he was going in the 4th or even into the 3rd, but I was like, Ezekiel Elliott used to be a first-round pick every year. Once drafters are not in on him anymore, he's going in the 3rd and 4th, but you have some people sticking with it and going, oh man, we're getting a value on Zeke now. You're catching a falling knife. Like that's a dead zone back. The year prior, I was referencing Mike Davis a ton. I don't know that I have a guy this year, and I look at this and I go, he's the obvious dead zone back. It's just a tough landscape. Some of them, and one of the other ways I've talked about the dead zone in the past, Sean, is the starters there's 32 teams. And so if you think about it as like in a perfectly equitable world, the number 1 running back for all 32 running backs would be ranked RB1 to RB32. That's not actually how it plays out. Obviously, we get 2 running backs from some offenses. They get pushed up a little bit, like the Lions. We mentioned David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. They both go in the top 30. But it's not way far off because of how running back touches are allocated. And so what I've often thought about the dead zone as is like the first half of the league, the first maybe 16 lead backs. People tend to buy into those backs. The market trusts them. They go after those guys. Those are the ones you can kind of trust as well with the market. Then the other 16, when you start to get these lead backs that are going still in a pretty valuable range of drafts, but only largely because they project to be the lead back in their offense, and it's a projection-related thing. Oh, well, this guy looks like no one that's going to come take his touches, but actually no one's really excited about him. The Wisdom of the Crowns isn't excited about him. ADP's not excited about him. That's traditionally been the way that I've thought about it. RB20 to RB30 is a big dead zone area. So when I look at a guy like James Conner, that's an example of that, right? In Arizona, who's the backup there? Rashad White, even another young player, but like he's fallen further than you would expect a year 2 guy to fall, who looks like he has no real competition behind him in terms of legitimate backup threats to touches. But I do think the market is saying, look, he wasn't that dynamic last year, and we don't, it's more of a dead zone placement in terms of it's a lead back on a team that actually projects to not be very good. Same with Connor, projects to not be very good. And we don't really know that they're actually going to have the dominant workhorse role all year that is easy to project for Jonathan Taylor or for Saquon Barkley, right? Like those guys, when healthy, are going to be the star running back in their offense. James Conner could lose the work midseason. Rashad White could lose the work midseason. We don't necessarily know to who, but that's, I think, what the dead zone tells us sometimes too. But again, you're talking about 7th round prices on those guys. I haven't taken a lot of either of them either in this dead zone mindset and in vein. But at 7th round prices, you start to get in some drafts that are wide receiver avalanches like you described. Those guys are going behind the close of the wide receiver window in those rooms. And then you start to say, well, maybe it's worth leaning into the guaranteed touches in the late 7th or into the 8th round potentially.
Especially perhaps if you can split those guys up on some teams. So you've limited the risk to having the guy go to 0. So many interesting things there as you work through. And as the conversation evolves, I have like 4 different questions or topics that I want to break down with you. But as I'm thinking about how you close there and with White and Connor, one of the really interesting things as it relates to best ball, but also globally, is when you look at these committees and you talked about like the top 16 backfields or the starter who is in the top 16 in terms of running back talent. and then the 17 through 32 range. And one of the things that we have always found is that in that range, especially when there is a committee where maybe the backup is either younger or more talented for whatever reason and has gotten kind of lodged in there. When you have these ADP gaps that are not particularly large, it's the guy in second place. It's the committee member who is not necessarily projected for as much early work or overall work, but you have a little bit of an advantage in price, which always helps. And then you often have that advantage in talent. And so that's the guy who historically has done the best in win rate, which then also works very nicely with zero RB as you're trying to build through these late guys. You're trying to get access to some points. Now, the thing for 2023, as opposed to all of the past years, is that we have to deal with or work through the consequences of, as you mentioned, there not being a punishment for going wide receiver early. You can still get those profiles. I think that the situation with White and the situation with Connor are so fascinating because those are two backfields where we don't have that small gap element. We don't have a backup who is being valued that far behind them, and yet they still are that deep because there is so much skepticism about both them and the offense that people are not in, even though there's nobody else on either of those teams. I mean, the only way right now that either of those teams have a backup without adding people, and there are a lot of names out there in free agency still, but the only way either of those teams have a backup is if an undrafted free agent in Sean Tucker is healthy at that point, and then he quickly becomes the best person on Tampa Bay. But there's no sense that that necessarily is going to happen. We just don't have any information on that. So that's a really interesting dynamic. But I guess then the place I would kind of like to start is right at the beginning and ask you about the traditional hyperfragile. There are two different things that we can do from a running back perspective to benefit from these trends. And if we have the running back dead zone being pushed down, you have the traditional hyperfragile approach where you've got to get the backs ahead of that dead zone. So it's got to be 1, 2, and 3. And then even in 3, it's kind of a tenuous pick. Now we have a case where I think that you explained pretty clearly why you can consider those names specifically who were in round 5 as backs who would exist either before the dead zone or they would be viable dead zone selections. I did a series on elite QB with hyperfragile where in looking at that, if you're going to get the elite QBs, you're going to get a wide receiver to go with them, then we're starting to talk about rounds 3, 4, 5 as being a 3 straight running back situation where you have the 3, sort of modified anchors. You have the 3 guys there. So when we're looking at this, and Mike Beers, who was one of the original authors of hyperfragile research and naming it and all of that, when he was drafting from the back end of the most recent MFL 10 of death, he went running back, running back, running back. The tricky part for me is that the third guy that he had access to was Najee Harris. So we have some questions there. But if you were in a draft, and especially maybe even a wide receiver avalanche draft, and you don't like the selections you're getting at receiver, and you do end up running back to where you can go Austin Eckler or Bijan Robinson, and then you can definitely take Saquon Barkley or Jonathan Taylor. And then you can come back with Ramondre Stevenson or Breece Hall. That's 3 guys who would be a potential 101 in a season that went well. They're all above the dead zone for 2023. Do you like that start? Maybe not as something that you're going to have a high exposure to, but is that a start that you're going to work into some of your exposures?
That's a question I've been asking myself. I've not worked it into, but I've only recently started drafting a lot. I feel like playing around with builds is an important part of drafting a lot of teams. So it's something that I've definitely asked myself and considered. I would say that my gut and my immediate thought is that I'm scared of that a little bit. But one of the benefits of that, and one of the angles I wanted to go, or directions I wanted to go with this discussion of like the first 16 backs and the second 16 backs on the 32 teams and which ones the market is buying into, is one of the elements of the running back trends we've seen as they've continued to be pushed down in round 3 and round 4. We're talking about RB15 being a 5th round pick. Is that it could be a multi-year trend or, whatever, a 2023 trend that the market isn't buying as many lead backs in their offenses, right? Like in the past, maybe it was 16, maybe it was 20 some seasons that we felt really good about the number one running back. It could be the case that other seasons we only feel good about 10 of them. And that actually makes some sense when we talk about the age 25 plus running backs that were second rounders last year and how that class has aged out. And there isn't a great transition. There are not a lot of 24-year-old, 25-year-old star running backs right now. There's a couple really young guys, but obviously Breece Hall coming back from an injury and Javonte Williams coming back from an injury. We have Bijan to add to the mix. But there was a little bit of a lull.
Early seasons. Sorry, when you lose the early seasons from ETN and Dobbins as well, and you take out those four guys you mentioned, that completely changes what running back looks like in terms of who people are willing to draft.
Right. And so those are the guys that normally would be the first and second rounders at this stage of their career. But you have like a little bit of a 3-year. I haven't looked at the drafts recently either, but I think if you go back and you look at drafts and you look at a couple of those seasons where the running backs just didn't hit as well as they could have, that Dobbins class with Akers obviously getting hurt as well. I mean, that's a JT class, but CEH was the first round running back and didn't hit. That was supposed to be a really deep running back group JT's really the only one going in the first 3 rounds.
Swift is maybe, the sixth or seventh most talented running back in the NFL, can't stay healthy.
Yeah. So, is JT the only one going in the first 4 rounds from that class? And those guys should be right in the middle of their primes, but a lot of injuries and a lot of unfortunate circumstances with, the guys like CH, and it just hasn't really panned out that class. So anyway, I do wonder if over the multi-year element of the running back position, we are in a spot where there really are only 11 or 12 or 10 teams where the market wants to buy this guy as potentially legendary upside, as Pat Kerrane would write about, right? And that's maybe why Najee Harris is going RB12, even though he probably doesn't fit the legendary upside type profile. ETN and Gibbs go right behind that. Kenneth Walker right behind that. I think those guys are interesting, certainly could potentially fit it. But drafters might be telling us a little bit that they don't buy, ETN or Walker. Gibbs, I think as a rookie, is an easy one to say. We haven't seen him yet, and drafters are usually a little bit hesitant to jump. Early in the offseason, I thought he was going, there was a couple drafts we talked about. He was like in the second round. I thought he was maybe going too high. I love his price. Now that's in the 4th round. I think he's an easy, and we've talked about this. Blair Andrews wrote a great piece recently as well about how he's the best value in every draft. I love that call. I'm right on that with him on that as well. I think he's an easy pick. And yet it still structurally is a hard one to make sometimes, right? So the one thing I was going to say with this point was if they're real, like the way that hyper fragile build could work, Sean, I think when you're talking about get that third running back being a Breece Hall, somebody who, if it really is an atmosphere where we think there are only 11 potential elite backs, say, or 12, and you get 3 of them and you hit the 3 that hit, right? It could be the type of season where they're, obviously, some of those 12 aren't going to hit. That's one of the elements of all of this that is sort of unsaid, but running back risk is a real thing. And we want the elite upside to then take on that risk. Otherwise, there's no point to actually drafting running backs really, really high if they don't actually have the elite upside. Then they're small wins, big miss type, small hit, big miss type players. We want at least a big hit because a running back early is always a big miss type player. It's just the reality of it. We know that to be the case. But if there are only maybe 12-ish instead of 16 or 18 or 20 that are legit RB1 candidates, and you get 3 of those, and they all hit, and they're the 3 that hit, and 6 of the other top 12 don't hit. Maybe there's 3 others, decent-sized hits, but you get the 3 big hits on your roster, you're going to win. You're going to win that league, that 12-team league, and you're going to win. And it's not going to matter that your running back or that your receivers don't have the depth that we want. That's the only way I can really see it, is if running back is as much of a wasteland as ADP is sort of suggesting that it is, and that you have the ability to get 3 of the true elites. It's almost like going back to 0 RB when running back was really heavy. And when you originally wrote about 0 RB, what we could do in those drafts was get 3 of the top 12 receivers, or even 4 or 5 sometimes. You could get so much receiver firepower, all of the elites on one roster. And when they all hit together, you just had such a dominant receiving room. It was ridiculous. You can kind of do potentially a little version of that at running back, where if those guys end up being the dominant ones and you have all of them, that can be pretty huge. The flip side of this is, okay, what if Jahmyr Gibbs hits? What if Dobbins hits out of the dead zone? What if late round running backs who can hit better than late round receivers hit? I think you're in a really tough spot in any of those outcomes, because when you go running back, you're going to have a really hard time getting enough receiver, catching up at receiver, getting enough receiver depth. And you were talking about a scenario where maybe you're going Kelsey Mahomes and getting an elite tight end and an elite quarterback, and then going running back through round 5. You have no receivers. You might still be able to pick out 3 running backs in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. You might still, some of those types of setups are can be really challenging, because you're not going to be able to get, I think, the receiver depth that you need. But I don't think it's completely unviable is what I'm getting at. The example you laid out, the Eckler or Bijan in the 1st, the JT or Barkley in the 2nd, the Brees falling in the 3rd. And then you can start hitting receiver in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, maybe still get 4 pretty solid receivers before the window closes. You're playing late round quarterback and late round tight end. But if you're right on those 3 running backs and you're still able to get some receiver depth, that team can dance a little bit, I think.
And you mentioned there the late round QB, the late round tight end. My take is that this is a perfect season for that, which opens it up a little bit. So you have multiple dynamics that are pointing in the same direction. Most seasons are very poor for late QB. And that elite tight end gives you such a trump card that we have issues with. If you go running back early, how are you going to ever get the wide receivers? The interesting thing here, I think, is with Gibbs, and him starting to fall is at least partially the result of entering into this range that receivers start to get pretty interesting. And so we now have a lot of drafters who are deciding to grab a Keenan Allen, to grab a DeAndre Hopkins, to grab a Jerry Jeudy ahead of him. And that's pushing him down. I think that makes sense. It also is interesting if those guys are gone, if you would then pivot back to Gibbs. And the other interesting element would be if we have these guys pushed down. And in the article there, I've got some pretty crazy stats about Travis Etienne, if anybody wants to check that out. There are also some pretty interesting numbers on J.K. Dobbins, not to the extent of Etienne, who really does kind of look like a Jamal Charles type of player. Now, based on the way his early career went, and based on the rhetoric coming out of there, the selection of Tank Bigsby and some other things, it looks extremely unlikely that he's going to hit something like that. So we want to keep that in mind. But from a talent perspective, for some of the things he's done in the past, it really is pretty crazy there. And you get in this situation where, unlike in the past, if you go wide receiver, then running back is pretty interesting. You mentioned that the Dobbins thing is difficult, and it's difficult in part because the round 6 wide receivers are really the strongest area of 2023 drafts. They feel a little bit uncomfortable at those prices because we're used to getting them more inexpensively, and yet there's still better values related to positional ADP than the guys earlier. And so there's going to be a lot of temptation to take one of those players so you can put both of them on a team, get one in round 5, get one in round 6, as opposed to taking J.K. Dobbins. And that's true even in perhaps especially in wide receiver avalanche drafts. Pete and I actually drafted Dobbins in round 7 in one of ours. I think once he falls there, then, you're like, yeah, I'm going to take J.K. Dobbins.
Yeah.
But that part of it, Ben, I think is so fascinating. Once we get into the dead zone, though, it is tricky because, as you mentioned, these names, they're dead zone guys that we've had in the past. And so it's that range where, and this is, I think, the part that's also interesting with the avalanche drafts, where if you're getting to the end of the wide receiver group, but the names who have been pushed down, if you have Joe Mixon pushed down a couple of rounds, is that something that you then jump on? If you have Alexander Madison or Isaiah Pacheco pushed down, if you have Dalvin Cook pushed down, if you have Miles Sanders pushed down, and I would consider myself a Miles Sanders enthusiast, but I also don't think there's hardly any gap between him and his backup. That's always a huge problem, especially if the offense.
He might be the quintessential dead zone back this year, honestly, Miles Sanders, unfortunately, but he might be.
And so do you like those guys when they are falling as one-off types of plays, And how much do we have to factor in some of the things too? I mean, Joe Mixon, you have his talent, you have a potential suspension. I think that we're still looking then, as you sort of had mentioned, at round 9. And we're starting to move into this range where we would traditionally pivot to the running backs. They're less expensive now. They're names that we like a lot. I don't know if there are a ton of players there, but that's kind of the next choice that we have to make. A Cam Akers, a DeAndre Swift, a Javonte Williams coming off of injury, a James Cook not knowing how much the Bills offense will go to running backs and will go to him. You have A.J. Dillon, you have Samaje Perine, you have Antonio Gibson. I mean, these are the names that if they were in this range in previous years, you'd be 100% exposure.
Right. And that's when we talk about like Connor and Rachaad White, it's so interesting because they are going so far down, even though they don't even have backups that are getting drafted in most drafts. And yet I'm hardwired mentally. When you ask me what I'm excited to do, even when those guys fall, I don't want to take them because what I want is to fade that exact type of player that is guaranteed touches, which I know other drafters get excited about that. It's like, he's their lead back. We want touches at running back. The way that I think about it in terms of what actually excites me, I'm just telling you, when I see on the clock and I see one of those guys behind ADP, I'm mad because I'm like, now I have to consider this player. I want someone else to draft him. The guy that I get excited about, or the guys that I get excited about, are the ones that are the second running backs taken on their team, but they're that high because that's the one that is being pushed up despite a lack of guaranteed touches, right? So now A.J. Dillon fits that for me. A couple of years ago, I was really in on Dillon. Last year, he got pushed up into like the 5th round and didn't take much of him. We're back in this 9th round A.J. Dillon range. And Aaron Jones is a 5th round running back. And you talked about the small gap guy, and that's been shown over at RotoViz a lot of different ways that those small gap running backs, were 2 from the same offense. You want to target that second one. I mean, but it's been shown quantitatively, not just this feel thing that I'm talking about, but for me, yeah, it's him. It's Samaje Perine. It's Antonio Gibson, who has recently flipped Brian Robinson. I just like Gibson's profile more, but you're talking about both the running backs going in that range. They're in an incredibly small gap. They're going back-to-back as the first 2 Washington backs off the board. Rashad Penny as the second in the Eagles offense behind Swift. Damian Harris as the second behind James Cook. Those are the guys that I'm taking a ton of, Sean. That's like the list of my highest running back exposures. Every time I get into that range, I'm mentally diving into the player that is the second in his backfield over the ones that, I mean, Alvin Kamara goes in this range. He's facing a possible suspension. I have taken a lot of those other quote-unquote backups or number 2s over Kamara in a lot of drafts. Now, I've also taken Kamara. I talked to you about this a little bit recently where he was like 20 picks after ADP, but he looks like this really aging back, but he's been decent enough in the past game, and I'm willing to make some caveats and say, because of the suspension risk, you're getting a really different price on him. Probably gets suspended, but he could be a late season 0 RB receiving back. I think he still probably has some talent in the receiving game. So once he gets even cheaper than where his ADP is, I've taken him, like I told you, 20 plus picks after ADP in a draft where I had already kind of played into Tampa's passing game, taking some Godwin and Evans. It was a nice bring back situation. But anyway, that's not a guy I'm targeting heavily. The other backs in that range that are the second on their team, the first set of second backs on their team to start going off the board are the ones that I find myself taking a lot of.
The other thing that I think is perhaps interesting is that I think you could argue that we've actually seen a few of these backfields flip to where the traditional second guy is actually the more expensive one at this point. And with Gibbs, that's a little bit tricky because he went so early in the draft and he is such an elite talent. But
that's who I thought of when you said that, Gibbs Montgomery.
Purely profile-wise, I mean, Montgomery would be probably the guy who usually goes earlier. I mean, James Cook, Damian Harris, that's probably one where Cook goes first. But you look at some of the profile elements, and there would be years where those guys would be even closer together. You have someone like a DeAndre Swift and a Rashad Penny. Now, Penny, the issue there is just the injuries are so omnipresent that may be the part that's knocking him down. But if we actually thought that both DeAndre Swift and Rashad Penny were going to be healthy going into the season, then Penny, again, traditionally the player with the kind of workload, especially with his talent, where you would say that's probably the more expensive guy, and especially the way that the Eagles actually run their offense. I mean, if it were an offense that were extremely pass heavy to the running back, then maybe Swift would be first. But in that offense, you would expect it to be Penny, but DeAndre Swift is the more expensive guy. That kind of leads me into the other point here, and not that people aren't following this. I think that the prices on ETN and Dobbins, Gibbs, all of those names that you mentioned earlier are the result of this. But we really had two separate things happen last year that were very interesting in terms of the running back results and the running back prices, which is that we got Josh Jacobs and Miles Sanders out of the dead zone and as dead zone profiles who hit. And anytime that you have that, you're going to have people say, well, then, I mean, maybe this is going to happen some more. They know that there's a one-off element to it in part, but they're also going to say, maybe even though it was over a long period of time and a lot of players, maybe there's a fluky element about what happened historically. But the other thing that happened is that you have players in Ramondre Stevenson and Tony Pollard who were bid way, way up in the last, say, 3 weeks or so. In the last 3 weeks of drafts, they were bid up so far above what you could possibly justify when you look at their workload. And they both hit.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime that happens, then you're going to have drafters lean into those players, and the likelihood that a talented back is going to take the workload is going to vanquish the other player in that backfield. And so you're going to have more of these backups or committee backs who appear to be the far superior talent bid up way past where the workload is. My question would be, if we have some names like that this year, and we do appear to have the guys that we've been discussing, are they going to have a little bit of a ceiling in terms of being bid up because of the wide receiver avalanche that keeps them at such great values this year and keeps them as players that we can rely on all the way through draft season? Or are we going to see that dynamic again in August where these guys look great in training camp? They look great if they touch the ball in preseason games. In many cases, they'll probably be held out. But as the drumbeat out of camp occurs, are these talented running backs going to go up? Because you still have to get your receivers. I mean, you can't simply be like, oh, well, I'm going to go off the receiver, because then you don't get anybody. Or you don't get enough. You don't get the right balance on your roster. And best ball drafters now understand you have to have that wide receiver positional allocation hit by a certain point, or you simply will not be competitive.
One of the things that's interesting is we've spent a lot of time talking about Underdog, but the receivers are going higher on Underdog even than other sites right now. And you're talking about what's going to happen by August. And it might be an Underdog specific scenario there. The other element that plays into this is the quarterback ADPs, which are way up there. They've started to fall a little bit, but they're way up there in the second, third. You got multiple quarterbacks, not just a couple. I thought it was possible that Mahomes, Hurts, and Allen would all go up there, but the fact that that's pulled Lamar, Burrow, Fields, Herbert into the first 5 rounds is honestly a little bit bonkers, because if you go look at quarterback scoring last year, yes, the elites separated, but it was kind of a big gap after that. Justin Fields, for example, ran for 1,100 yards and didn't differentiate from the massive quarterbacks that we often see from like QB4 to QB20. That has been the argument for late round quarterback. He didn't really differentiate from that because he didn't throw for a ton of yards and touchdowns. There is room for him to go to the next level with the type of rushing profile he has. There's also room for his rushing to come back. He's one that I have had a hard time with at his price. I think I have taken him a couple times. I like the player a lot. But he had a good rushing season last year, a really good one, and didn't differentiate. It was Mahomes, Hurts, and Allen. Anyway, there's a lot of QBs being pushed up. What's going to happen by August is going to be really interesting. I've seen some industry drafts and things where I've started to see Josh Jacobs go already in the first round, like some magazine draft type things, and I've seen Josh Jacobs go in the late first round. I think some of these, Jacobs, Derrick Henry, maybe Brees and Ramondre. I'm not entirely sure what the market's going to do with them, but Najee Harris is another one just from workload. I think some of those guys are probably going to suck up and move into the second round. And then it's, okay, does ETN settle in the third? Does Gibbs settle in the third? Who else comes with? I think Mixon does probably wind up settling in the third because he's one that people can tell themselves a story about. Dalvin Cook right now is still going in the seventh without a team. Like if he lands in Miami, I think he could settle in the third or fourth round potentially. So not guys I'm going to want to take, but it will be. It wouldn't be crazy to me if we actually do see some of the running backs take a more traditional shape in the third and fourth round, and then there has to be running backs pulled up, and so then you have like the James Connors moving into the more traditional dead zone, and you can't even tell yourself the story of, well, he's a dead zone back, but I'm getting an 8th round price tag on him, and I'm getting him after the wide receiver window, and so maybe it makes sense. I think we might see those guys. Alexander Madison's another one that could suck up, like I said, with Mixon, where his ADP actually sucks up into the third, fourth round. I don't know why I'm using the phrase sucks up so much, but it will be interesting to see this this running back group take shape. And what you were describing with Penny and those guys, whoever you want to throw in there, Gibson, these potentially talent bets, not jumping into the Ramondre Stevenson Pollard range of last year where it was really hard to justify taking them over the receivers that were going there. What I'm describing is a scenario where those guys maybe would follow that trend by August and be in that 7th round, right? Which would suck. The alternative is I'm wrong and it doesn't happen, right? Like that, then that's maybe plausible. It's going to be really interesting because for all of those running backs to go up, you do need a lot of receivers to start to fall. You do need the quarterbacks probably to fall too eventually, because I think you can't have 6 quarterbacks in the first 4 rounds and have all those running backs go up to the ranges that I was talking about. So there's a couple multiple different dynamics at play here, and we are still in June, and we've never really seen anything like this, and so I don't really know how it's going to play out by August, how the market's going to react, but it's going to be fascinating. I think we are going to get more sort of quote-unquote casual drafters entering the field and wanting things to look like they've looked in the past and drafting it accordingly, and that might lead to some shifts.
And that tracking that is going to be so much fun. I just finished here today in the same place that I started with, just how much I'm enjoying these dynamics. You mentioned industry drafts. It'll be interesting to see if experts have that impact when the more casual player is brought into the field. Because right now, again, it's not a thing like we're right or something like that, but the dynamic is driven by players, and players are saying the wide receivers are the way to go there. I do think that we're going to see the QBs fall because as we go further and further, and then I really enjoyed our previous show. For anybody who didn't listen to it, we discussed our overall underdog outlook. And one of the things that I feel like we came to, at least in part, was that the early rounds really do need to be more about running back and wide receiver than ever before. And it takes the onesies out of it a little bit, which, I mean, in some ways that's unfortunate because I think it's a lot of fun to draft these teams with perfect starting lineups. And yet for the QBs to be worth where they're going right now, they have to hit on big outcomes, and you have to have a lot of injuries to the rest of the position, which is the thing that people kind of forget about. If you don't get a lot of injuries to the rest of the position, it still doesn't really work out for you. So as that portion of it kind of penetrates the consciousness of the field a little bit more, I think we're going to see some falling. Now, those guys are still good. They're going to stay high. But because that battle to get both running backs and wide receivers is going to be so fierce throughout the summer, you're going to see a little bit of a push there. But Ben, it's been so awesome having this discussion with you, our resident and the overall industry's dead zone expert. All I know is that the other big takeaway I had from this is that on our risers and fallers tool over at RotoViz, we're going to change the risers part to sucks up. It's going to who sucks up in the last 3 weeks. So,
yeah, I mean, again, you say I'm the president, whatever. I'm mostly just throwing these ideas at you, hoping you'll agree with them, because so much of them build off of the original Zero RB logic, thesis, everything you wrote about. So, I mean, it's been a decade since you wrote that original piece, Shawn, and so many of the concepts are still so applicable and people still don't understand them. That's what makes them still exploitable. But so much of that Dead Zone stuff builds off of that logic and that team building and structural drafting philosophy. And so it's always fun to talk with you about it as well. Get your thoughts on my ramblings about it, or what I'm thinking about it. So this is a fun episode. It's been a blast.
So we've had a good time. We hope that you as the listener have had fun with us. We appreciate you guys so much. You're the ones who make the show. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always has been Gretch. Make sure you follow him at YardsPerGretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Lines. We'd love to have you guys join us over at RotoViz. The 2023 sub is going to cost a little bit more than it does right now. So anybody who is listening and wants to get in, make sure you do that. You can get even a little bit more off using the coupon code RVRadio2023 at checkout. We'd love to have you guys join us over at Underdog. Use the coupon code RotoViz over there. That'll help you. Ben and I will be back with a new episode soon. We're both going to be drafting a lot. Underdog, FFPC. Our Dynasty team has a lot of players. We're going to make some trades. So much content we're looking forward to sharing with you guys over the summer. We love you all. We'll talk to you soon.